The first jazz musician I became friends with. And it happened in the following way. I think earlier on in our conversations, forget in what context, I may have mentioned this girl I met who was the first one to take me to Harlem. She took me to the Apollo. I think we talked about that. And she took me to a place. She had met Randy before, or seen him. She kind of had a thing for him. You know, Randy was this, it's remarkable. A few years later, I think he might have become a basketball player. Not that that's what he wanted to be, but, you know, that was his size. And she took me to a place downtown in the village, or just maybe West Village. It was a place that was the site of a union, local something or other. You know, at that time, a lot of CIO unions were pretty left-wing, you know. This was a small, I forget what trade it was, and that was Local 66 or something like that. And they had a dance on a weekend, and Randy had the band. There was a quartet, and the bass player was Ahmed Abdul Malik, which is the first time I met him. And Ahmed, of course, he wasn't somebody who adopted Muslim religion. He was a genuine, you know, he was a genuine African descent. That was his real name, not a, you know, an invented name. And a drummer named Edgar Bateman. And I forget who the horn player was, but anyway, Randy, first of all, impressed me with his size, and he was a really great-looking guy, you know, and with his piano playing, which was wonderful. And we talked, and it was typical. I think I mentioned this before when I talked about my encounter with Tad Dameron at the Royal Rooster. The fact that I was from Europe, interested in musicians, because this is a time before the, you know, mass exodus to Europe of people who stayed there, like Dexter Gordon, but people who went, you know, for festivals and concerts, all kinds of things. Europe really opened up to jazz. This is still 1947, so he was interested in hearing about that. But for some reason, I don't know why, he took a liking to me, and I certainly took a liking to him. In any case, he invited me to come out to Brooklyn, which is where he lived, where he introduced me to his father's restaurant. It was a little place that specialized in West Indian stuff, and visited him at his apartment. He lived in, at the time he was still living in Brooklyn. So we became friends, and this was very important to me at the time. He was, as I said, the first jazz musician I really became friends with, and he was someone who already was very conscious of the problems that confronted black people in America, something that I have become aware of, and if I repeat myself, tell me so, but when I grew up in Europe, and I went through, luckily I got out of, you know, because of what the Danes did, I was not trapped by the Holocaust. I got out of Denmark and got to Sweden and everything. But I was very conscious of that, and I also, because of two things, my interest in jazz and also the fact that the fate of the condition of African Americans in the United States. You know, that was something that touched me in terms of what the Jews had gone through in Europe. So I acquired this huge tome by a Swedish sociologist named Gunnar Myrdal. It's called An American Dilemma. And I'd also read a lot. I read Faulkner, and I read, you know, this Erskine Caldwell novel called Trumbull in July that deals with the lynching and all sorts of stuff. I was very interested in that. So Randy was very race conscious at the time already. This was just before he really became interested in Africa. But that came about as he acknowledged, even very late in life, always acknowledged that it was due to Marshall Stearns that he became aware of the African roots of jazz. And Marshall was, of course, the founder of the Institute of Jazz Studies, so at the time I had no connection with Marshall, but it's a weird, you know, kind of coincidence. Anyway, Marshall was doing stuff at the Lenox Inn, up in the Berkshires in Mass, you know. So Randy was there. He was, the first time he was there, he was actually doubling as a cook. He was a very good cook. And that's the first time he was at Lenox. But then he was there as a musician. And he invited me, this would have been probably like the second or third year of our friendship. First time, you know, I came to Brooklyn to visit him, to mention his father's restaurant, but also I went to a house jam session in somebody's apartment in Brooklyn, you know, had a terrific guitarist named Rector Bailey, who never got his dues. He didn't record a lot at all, and only in a, you know, sort of relegated position. A few musicians knew about him. He was terrific. And I remember they played, it was Randy and Rector and a bass player, and they played Body and Soul for about half an hour. And that was the first time that, you know, I had been exposed to something like that, which is not what you encounter in a club or on a recording, before LPs. Anyway, it was quite fascinating. And so my friendship with Randy then led to, I also had become involved in, there was a United Nations Jazz Society. That was founded by Bill Dixon, who was a somewhat controversial avant-garde trumpet player who later got himself almost lifelong gig teaching at a major college in New England. I forget which one it was. I think it was one that mostly had female students. But Bill founded this United Nations Jazz Society, which was not made up of delegates and stuff, although they could come, but it was staff people who were jazz fans. And they had events and things. I remember later on I had an exchange with Bill in Metronome about something. But in any case, he founded it, but at the time that involved me there, a very nice man named Richard Jennings, who worked at the UN in a clerical position and was a good friend of Randy's, was the one who ran the society. So anyway, the two of them were staying up in Lenox, and they invited me to come up, you know, for a weekend and stayed with them. And Richard and I became good friends. He did a great job at the UN, but most of all, he was really a dedicated jazz fan who, knew a lot of people, and it was a very nice, who unfortunately died much too soon. We were also on a cruise together and stuff, one of the very few cruises I ever went on. So we had this really nice week or so, excuse me, up in Lenox, and this was at the time when an Ellington record had come out, which had a connection with me insofar as I had been at the recording session where this was done, which was an Ellington session of an unusual thing for Duke, because it was not Ellington music. The arrangements were all by Billy, by Strayhorn, but it was a kind of semi-hit Broadway show called All American, and the composer was a guy named Charles Strauss, and he was there at the session and sat there with his mouth open most of the time of what they were doing with his music, and which was wonderful. And there's one thing on there, probably the best piece in the score, was a thing called I've Just Seen Her, which featured Paul Gonsalves, and it was a wonderful, wonderful thing for Paul, which led to, and I may have mentioned this before, it led to something totally unprecedented, which was that after he got through playing it, the band applauded. Now, the Ellington band was such a collection of individuals who very rarely acted in common and very often the opposite. But Paul was so great on this that, they just burst into applause. Now, this had come out, and I forget whether Richard or Randy, it wasn't me, brought the record along in Lenox, and Randy became so enamored of this that we were playing it day and night constantly. And this was like at Marshall Stern's, was the first time that I was exposed to Marsh. And so this was, Randy and I really got to be pretty close. Then he moved away from Brooklyn. He moved to Manhattan, and he had a beautiful big apartment on 13th Street and near 6th Avenue and 13th. And it was a real big apartment with, was an old house, with high ceilings and stuff. It had very good acoustics. He had a piano there, and he used to have little sessions there, and I was, lucky to be there a number of times. He also invited me to a recording session as one of his big African things. Melba Liston was a very close friend, and she did most of the arranging for anything he did with a large ensemble. And Melba was a remarkable lady. This was at a time, now we really have a goodly number of women who are, active in jazz and fairly well recognized, but at the time, she was pretty unique as somebody, she played trombone in Dizzy's big band, and she was, a known entity as an arranger. So it was interesting to be at Randy's sessions. He was a very good leader. He was not in any way, authoritarian. He knew how to get things by, being himself. And it was another session of his that I was lucky to be at, and by then I'd become friends with Coleman Hawkins. I think we talked about Hawk, and this was a session that was actually recorded at the 5 Spot, but in the daytime, with Kenny Dorham on trumpet and Hawk and Randy. And so, you know, this became a fairly, you know, important relationship for me, and very grateful to Randy for, you know, involving me in these things. And he was a very warm person. Really, you know, he was very. I don't know how to put it. He was a beautiful man. He was a marvelous person. And at the apartment, there would be get-togethers. I remember one time I was there were a bunch of people. There was a heavyweight championship fight with Floyd Patterson, and the Swedish guy, I forget what his name was. Ingemar Jonsson or
Maybe,
something.
yeah.
And he was the one who said that he had a left hand like thunder. Well, my left hand is like thunder. So we were watching this, and Patterson, Patterson was a very good fighter, but he wasn't brilliant like Sugar Ray Robinson, or, you know, really powerful like Joe Louis. But he was very good. But we were concerned that you know, that this thunder might hit him, but it didn't. He did very well, and he won. And there were a lot of people there at Randy's, and it was really fun. Mostly black people, so it was fun to be part of that audience. And another thing, another musical thing that happened at that apartment was Little House Jam, and Randy was very friendly with Booker Erwin. And Booker, I don't think we've talked a lot about Booker. Booker was a fabulous tenor player, one of my all-time favorites, and he is another, you know, early death victim. That was so sad. He had a kidney problem. He had uremia, and that. But Randy, he did quite a few things together. There's one recording where they do one of my favorite tunes of his called the Berkshire Blues, and it's, you know, Booker is just marvelous. And of course he was with Mingus, and if he had lived, he would be more famous than, I mean, he's known to jazz people, but he's not a big name. My friend Don Schlitten recorded him quite prolifically for Prestige, some beautiful records. But anyway, at this session at Randy's, there was Booker and John Gilmore. Now, John Gilmore is another tenor player with underground reputation.
With Sun Ra.
Hmm?
With Sun Ra.
Yeah, right. So anyway, the two of them, Randy had some very comfortable chairs, armchairs. They were sitting like at opposite corners of the room, the living room there. Both of them had comfortable chairs with their horns, and Randy at the piano. And it turned into a friendly battle, you know. And Booker won hands down. I mean, Gilmore was a nice player, but Booker, you know, without meaning to, ran right over him.
Let me stop you here for a second.